People think the most dangerous thing about an empath is how much they feel. They think the worst thing is their sensitivity, their vulnerability, their tendency to trust too deeply, love too hard, forgive too often. But they are wrong. The most dangerous part isn't an empath's kindness. It isn't their compassion. It isn't even their ability to absorb the emotions of everyone around them. The true horror begins when that kindness finally reaches its limit. When years of sacrifice collide with years of betrayal. When endless understanding meets relentless exploitation. When the person who always stayed becomes the person who silently leaves. Because there is something few people understand about empaths. Everyone talks about their light. Almost nobody talks about their darkness. And every empath has one, not because they are cruel, not because they are malicious, but because every human soul contains a shadow waiting beneath the surface, a hidden force, a buried power, a side of themselves they spend their entire lives trying not to become. The frightening truth is that an empath's dark side does not emerge through rage. It emerges through awakening. And when it finally arrives, it changes everything. Stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. Chase Hughes discovered something that most people never notice until it is too late. The traits we suppress do not disappear. They accumulate, they wait, they gather pressure beneath the surface of consciousness like steam trapped inside a sealed chamber. Hughes understood something terrifying about human psychology. The mind is constantly attempting to maintain equilibrium, psychic balance, a hidden order beneath the chaos. And whenever one side of a personality becomes too dominant, the opposite side begins growing in darkness. According to Jungian psychology, this process is known as compensation. The psyche seeks balance whether we cooperate with it or not. An empath who spends decades being understanding unconsciously suppresses aggression. An empath who endlessly sacrifices suppresses self-protection. An empath who constantly forgives often buries justified anger. And what is buried never stays buried forever. Jung called this hidden territory the shadow, the forgotten self, the rejected self, the pieces of identity abandoned in exchange for acceptance, the traits that were deemed dangerous, unacceptable, selfish, unlovable. But Hughes recognized that the shadow is not evil. The shadow is power without permission, and eventually that power demands recognition. For many empaths, life becomes an endless cycle of emotional labor. They become a sponge for pain, a silent collector of wounds that were never theirs to carry. They walk into rooms and immediately feel tension that nobody else notices. They sense sadness behind smiles, fear behind confidence, manipulation behind charm. And because they can feel it, they try to heal it, again and again, year after year, relationship after relationship. They become emotional first responders to people who never learned how to save themselves. They pour love into broken wells, and those wells never fill. They listen when nobody listens to them. They understand when nobody understands them. They forgive when nobody deserves forgiveness. Like a bridge stretched across a violent canyon, they spend their lives helping others cross safely while their own foundation slowly cracks beneath the weight. The tragedy is that most empaths do not even notice what they are losing. Their identity disappears gradually, one compromise at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one act of self-abandonment after another. They silence their instincts to avoid conflict. They suppress anger to maintain peace. They ignore red flags to preserve connection. They shrink themselves to keep others comfortable, until eventually they can no longer remember where other people end and they begin. The person staring back from the mirror feels unfamiliar, exhausted, drained, ghost-like, as if they have become a supporting character inside their own life. They built bridges for people who only burned them. They carried burdens for people who never intended to put theirs down. They offered loyalty to people who viewed loyalty as weakness, and still they stayed. Because leaving felt cruel. Because boundaries felt selfish. Because they believed love could heal what accountability never touched. But every rubber band has a breaking point. Not a dramatic explosion. Not a violent collapse. Just a final stretch. 1 inch too far. One betrayal too many. One disappointment too deep. Then something changes. Quietly. Almost invisibly. And this is the moment that terrifies people the most. Because there is no warning. No screaming. No emotional breakdown. No dramatic goodbye. Only silence. A switch flips. A lock turns. A receiver shuts down. The bridge collapses without making a sound. Inside the empath, something ancient finally awakens. The emotional signal that once connected them to the source of their suffering simply disappears. Like a radio frequency suddenly lost between mountains. Nothing. No anger. No desperation. No pleading. No hope. Just stillness. terrifying stillness. People often mistake this moment for emotional death. It is not. It is transformation. The manipulator believes they have finally pushed the empath too far, but that interpretation misses the truth entirely. The empath did not break. The illusion broke. The illusion that endless sacrifice creates love. The illusion that empathy requires self-destruction. The illusion that being needed is the same thing as being valued. The illusion shatters like glass beneath pressure that has been building for years. And once shattered, it can never be restored to its original form. This is where Hughes's understanding of human behavior becomes deeply unsettling. Suppressed traits return stronger, not weaker, stronger. The anger that was denied returns as boundaries. The confidence that was buried returns as self-respect. The instincts that were ignored return as clarity. The shadow emerges carrying everything the empath once believed they had to sacrifice to remain lovable. And suddenly, the person who tolerated everything begins tolerating nothing. Not because they became cold, because they became complete. Jung described a process called individuation, the integration of fragmented parts of the self into a whole human being. The journey towards psychological sovereignty. And for many empaths, the dark side is not the destruction of the self. It is the completion of the self. The part they feared became the part that saved them. The anger they spent years suppressing becomes emotional armor forged in fire. The boundaries they once feared become fortress walls protecting their peace. The self they abandoned returns home. Imagine a house that has been left unlocked for decades. Anyone could enter. Anyone could take. Anyone could leave damage behind. Then one day the owner returns. The locks are changed. The gates are secured. The alarms are activated. The house remains beautiful. But access is no longer free. That is what happens to an empath after shadow integration. The kindness remains. The compassion remains. The humanity remains. But access becomes earned, and that changes everything. The people who once benefited from unrestricted access are usually the first to panic, because manipulation depends on predictability. Control depends on emotional access. Exploitation requires an open door, and suddenly the door is gone. The guilt trips stop working. The emotional hooks find nothing to grab. The carefully rehearsed apologies sound strangely hollow. Love bombing feels transparent, predictable, almost embarrassing. The manipulator keeps pressing buttons that no longer connect to anything. It is like watching someone desperately dialing a disconnected number. Again, and again, and again. Confusion begins spreading across their face. The old tactics fail. The old scripts fail. The old control mechanisms fail. Because the empath has become psychologically unavailable to manipulation, not unavailable to love, unavailable to exploitation. There is a profound difference. This stage often looks mysterious from the outside. Friends notice it. Family notices it. Former partners notice it. They ask what happened. Why have you changed? Why are you different? Why are you so distant? But the empath knows something they do not. Distance was never the goal. Freedom was. The severed leash may look like detachment to the person holding it. To the person wearing it, it feels like liberation. This is where psychological immunity begins to emerge. Not emotional numbness, not bitterness. Immunity. The ability to encounter manipulation without absorbing it. The ability to hear criticism without collapsing. The ability to witness dysfunction without becoming responsible for fixing it. The ability to remain calm in situations that once created chaos. A remarkable stillness appears. A deep internal silence, the kind of silence found in forests before sunrise, the kind of silence found beneath ocean depths untouched by storms. External turbulence continues, but it no longer penetrates. The fortress stands, the gates remain closed, the foundation remains secure. Hughes often emphasized that true power is rarely loud, and this transformation proves it. The strongest version of an empath is almost never the most emotional. It is the most centered, the most grounded, the most self-possessed, the person who no longer reacts automatically, the person who chooses, the person who observes before engaging, the person who understands that attention is currency and refuses to spend it carelessly. This is individuation in action, the birth of sovereignty, the death of unconscious patterns, the emergence of someone who finally belongs to themselves. And perhaps the most misunderstood stage arrives last. Indifference. Many people assume indifference is hatred. It is not. Hatred requires emotional investment. Resentment requires attachment. Revenge requires focus. Indifference requires none of them. Indifference is transcendence. It is the moment an old wound stops demanding attention. The moment a closed chapter stops asking to be rewritten. The moment emotional gravity finally loses its hold, the empath stops explaining, stops defending, stops convincing, stops proving, stops hoping that someone will become who they promised to be. The need for validation evaporates. The need for understanding dissolves. The need for closure disappears, not because they stopped caring, because they started seeing clearly, and clarity changes everything. Imagine standing before a shattered illusion you once worshipped, a castle made entirely of fog. For years it seemed solid, powerful, permanent. Then one morning sunlight reveals what was always true. There was never a castle, only mist. You do not hate the mist. You simply stop believing in it. That is the final evolution. The empath becomes unreachable not through walls of anger, but through mountains of wisdom. They no longer chase, no longer plead, no longer negotiate with people committed to misunderstanding them. Their energy returns to its rightful owner. Their attention returns home. Their life becomes their own again. What others perceive as darkness is often the first authentic act of self-love they have ever witnessed. Because the empath's dark side was never cruelty. It was discernment. It was self-respect. It was the refusal to continue bleeding for people who celebrated the wound. It was the courage to stop abandoning themselves. And that is why it feels so powerful, so unsettling, so impossible to reverse. Because once a person discovers their own sovereignty, dependency loses its appeal. Once they taste freedom, captivity becomes obvious. Once they meet the self hidden beneath years of sacrifice, returning to self-abandonment feels impossible. The old version of them disappears like a signal fading into darkness, not destroyed, transcended. And this is the truth few people are willing to admit. The greatest mistake you can make with an empath is assuming their kindness has no limit, assuming their patience is infinite, assuming their forgiveness is permanent, because every soul eventually reaches the threshold where survival becomes more important than approval, where authenticity becomes more important than attachment, where truth becomes more important than comfort. And when that threshold is crossed, something extraordinary happens. The empath does not become your enemy. They become themselves. The silence that follows is often misunderstood. People think it is punishment. They think it is revenge. They think it is emotional withdrawal designed to create pain. But the silence means something far deeper. The silence is healing. The silence is integration. The silence is the sound of fragmented pieces returning home. They are no longer trying to earn love, no longer trying to rescue everyone, no longer trying to carry worlds that were never theirs to carry. The burden has been set down. The chains have been removed. The gates have closed. And behind those gates stands someone they spent a lifetime searching for. Themselves. Because in the end, they were never losing you. They were finding themselves. The bridge did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it carried more weight than it was ever meant to bear. The darkness that emerged was never evil. It was truth. It was wholeness. It was the shadow becoming integrated with the light. It was a soul reclaiming its sovereignty. And the silence you hear now is not emptiness. It is not abandonment. It is not revenge. It is the sound of a human being finally becoming whole. They are no longer waiting to be chosen. They have already chosen themselves.